Hello everybody, this is Allison Harrell with the Fort Bend Museum, and today I am standing in the beautiful 1901 Richmond Union Pacific Depot. This depot was used until 1961. It was later given to the Fort Bend History Association and moved to its current location in Decker Heritage Park, where it stands today. This is a building that the History Association doesn't use all of the time. We do open it up every year for Pecan Fest, and we've opened it up for a few other occasions. But to do an entire month of videos on trains and not film a single video in this building would have been an absolute crime, so that's where we are today. So today's video is going to focus on the economic and social changes that the railroad brought. So far, we've mostly been talking about the origins of the railroads and how they impacted the towns of Fort Bend County, how they started new towns, and how they sort of made other towns abandoned. So now we're going to talk about the grander impact that the railroad had across the board. The first way we're going to do that is by talking through all the railroads we've thus far mentioned and what happens to them. So we've all talked about the origins, but we haven't talked about what happens next. So the first railroad we have to talk about is the Buffalo Bayou, Brazos, and Colorado Railway. This railroad was the first in Fort Bend County, it was the first in Texas, and it connected Richmond to Galveston, so a very important port town. This railroad started in 1850, and it pretty successfully operated all the way until 1868. And at that point, it became the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railroad. The Buffalo Bayou, Brazos, and Colorado Railroad had come into financial difficulties. The entire railroad got reorganized and bought out, and the name was changed. Next up is the New York, Texas, and Mexican Railway. This is the railroad that connected Rosenberg to Victoria and was built by Giuseppe Telferner. And this railroad also went the same way. So this railroad was started in 1880, and it very successfully operated until 1905, when it was also bought out by the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railway. So let's talk about the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio Railway. This railway started from the defunct remains of the Buffalo Bayou, Brazos, and Colorado Railway and quickly began acquiring other tracks, pretty obviously. The right-of-way on the tracks that this company had acquired was soon purchased by the Southern Pacific Railway Company. Now, this company, since 1996, has been operating as Union Pacific. Union Pacific is the second largest railroad in the United States. They have over 32,200 miles of track, and they cross 23 states in America. Now, the next railroad we need to talk about is the San Antonio and Aransas Pass Railway. This is the railroad that started the town of Fulshear and kind of made everyone leave the town of Pittsville. Now, this railroad was started in 1884, and in 1934, it was acquired by the Texas and New Orleans Railway. So, changed its name, just like every other railroad in Texas. Now, it was later absorbed into the Southern Pacific family as well. So, normally I would have grouped it under the Southern Pacific and then Union Pacific family group, but I know for a fact that the specific rail line that went through Fulshear has been taken out entirely and is no longer used. So while the rest of the tracks of this company are still being utilized by Union Pacific, the specific line in Fort Bend County is not. The next railroad we have to talk about is the Gulf, Colorado, and Santa Fe Railroad. Now, this is the railroad that started in Galveston in 1873. It came up through Fort Bend County, and it is directly responsible for the founding, creation, and naming of the city of Rosenberg. Now, in 1886, this railroad merged with another. It merged with the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. And this particular railroad is very important because of a deal they made in 1876. So the deal they made was with a man named Fred Harvey. The deal was that Harvey was going to build a number of eating establishments along the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. Now, these restaurants soon became incredibly famous. They were considered Harvey houses, they were waitressed entirely by Harvey Girls, and they are one of the factors that has been listed as having tamed the Wild West. Now, the Harvey Girls, these waitresses, it was an all-female, all-white staff. They were given very strict codes of conduct. They were given a very strict uniform. They were given $18.50 a month plus room and board. They were given a curfew. They could not be married while they were being employed, and they were also not allowed to wear makeup or chew gum while they were on the clock. So these waitresses across many restaurants across the entire railroad really sort of changed how people viewed travel. They were high-class establishments with wonderfully nice waitresses, and these Harvey houses really kind of changed the landscape. Now, in case you're wondering, Rosenberg actually did have a Harvey house. So we have some pictures of the Harvey house. And if you want to learn more about the Harvey house, that whole establishment, or even more about railroads in general, do check out the Rosenberg Railroad Museum. They're literally one town away from us. They're super wonderful, and they usually have a number of festivals every year centered around trains. Also, if you are a model train enthusiast, I do suggest you check it out. As a final note of the legacy of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, it does still operate today. It does still operate in Rosenberg, but it now uses the name BNSF Railway. So they are actually the largest freight railroad network in North America. They have 3 transcontinental railway routes, and they have 32,500 miles of track in 28 states. So they are still there, they are still operating, and they are still quite impressive. Next, I want to talk about how the railroad has really changed Fort Bend County specifically, and in the number of ways it has changed it. So the first thing I want to do is talk about how this has changed the way cattle drives were done. So I'm going to insert a clip from the George Ranch Annual Cattle Roundup. This year's was held on March 20th, 2021, and this is a clip from Smokey talking about the railroad.
When they started this railroad industry hauling cattle back in the 1860s, it revolutionized the cattle industry because he could, where it took 2 to 4 months to get these cattle from here to the market, New Orleans or Chicago or Denver or Kansas City, they could do it in a matter of days with the train. So it just really changed things up.
Smokey is a volunteer at the George Ranch Historical Park, and he is very often at the park on Saturdays. He's also a poet, and so he has many talents, and if you have many questions about railroads, I would suggest trying to go to the park and see if he's working there that day, because he might be able to answer many more questions than I ever will be able to. Now, to expand on what Smokey was saying, the cattle cars started out at 36 feet long, but over time they started expanding. So they didn't have much ventilation when they were first built, but over time they were extended to 50 feet long, like the cattle car at the George Ranch. They also had ventilation added in because they were stuffing somewhere between 10 and 20 longhorn cows into these cars. So eventually they also started adding in water and food for the cows to make the journey more comfortable for the cow. Longhorns do have very long horns, as their name implies, and in a very tight space they can do a lot of damage to themselves, to others, and to train cars as well. So it is important that when you're transporting things like cows, you do make a number of accommodations to keep them happy and healthy. Now, the train industry did really kill the cattle drive industry. There was no need to run your cows all the way up to Kansas to get to a train line when you could just go to your backyard. So that really changed the way that people were able to make money and how much effort they had to put into selling their product. The railroads were also very instrumental in helping in disasters, not just with economic growth. So after the 1899 flood, the railroad was able to deliver supplies and relief to those that were affected. We have a number of pictures based on the rail tracks of that flood because the rail tracks were above the floodwaters, so they were a higher ground. Now, after the storm of 1900 absolutely decimated Galveston, the railroad was also instrumental there, bringing in supplies and relief and help after that disaster as well. So rail tracks tend to stay around, and they make it very easy to safely get supplies to disaster-affected areas. With the advent of the railroad, it meant not only could you get your goods to market faster, but you could get different goods back from market. So things like ice became available first on train cars that were being brought in from other places, and later ice factories were built in Richmond and Rosenberg themselves. So when new products became available or new technology, it could be shipped in on the railroad to more efficiently distribute it across places like Fort Bend County. Now, the railroad also provided a meeting and gathering space for people. As mentioned, the Harvey houses were a very easy place to gather. Train depots like this one would have been a pretty easy meeting place. So if you had someone coming in from out of town, you could meet them at the rail station. You'd probably start talking there and then bring your conversation on to other places and other businesses and establishments. Now, it is also important to note that some families benefited more from the railroad than others. So some families, like the Dew family in what is now Missouri City, actually had their own train spur. So they had a direct line from their property to the train line, which meant that it was even easier for them to get goods to market than for some others. Now, places like the George Ranch didn't have their own train line, but the train line went as far as Crab. So it was pretty close. It wasn't as far as a journey from the ranch to Kansas as it was for the ranch to Crab. Now, another benefit of this was that because the railroad was such a hub and such a place that people needed to go all the time, the towns that were built along the train lines tended to grow bigger due to the railroad. So towns like Fulshire were founded because of the railroad, but they also continued to grow because of the railroad. So towns like Richmond gained more prominence because they had a railroad and because people were constantly coming to bring goods to market. It made sense for more people to move to Richmond and for Richmond to grow itself. So the railroad not only could create new towns and it could sort of abandon old ones, but they would also help existing towns grow bigger as more people came to bring goods. I hope you can tell by now that the railroad has absolutely changed the fabric of Fort Bend County. It's changed many different aspects of Fort Bend County. We still have trains that come through today. I've heard that they come through Richmond every 17 minutes. So in case you've ever wondered what the time scale on that is, every 17 minutes there's a train crossing through. So I hope you learned something and I hope you enjoyed this excellent video, and we'll see you next time. Bye.